I'm grateful to be part of the Crawford family for many reasons, but two really stand out for me. I'm very, very grateful, first of all, for being asked to deliver this address tonight, because obviously many talented and dedicated people have gone before me, and it's nice to become part of that club. So that's very nice. My contribution, by the way, tonight will be on my own behalf, and not as a member of the Crawford board or on behalf of the Crawford Fund for Food Security. A very, very little caveat to put on it, I think. Second, I'm grateful to the family for the introduction to the life and work of John Crawford. As a former minister and shadow minister, I was in the portfolio for 10 years, sadly more in opposition than government, but that happens. So I knew of him, but before joining the Crawford Fund for Food Security, I didn't really fully appreciate his contribution, his life's work, and the difference he made, and of course, the effectiveness and extent of his public service and the legacy he's left us. He was obviously a great Australian, and of all the things, for me, all the things that he achieved and did and is remembered for, the one that stood out for me is his appreciation and understanding of the value and the ability to deploy soft power. That really stood out for me, and I'm very, very grateful to Dennis Blight and Nicholas Brown, who of course wrote the book on Crawford. I read that, and for me, that was the most powerful message about what he was. He was an economist, of course, not an agricultural scientist, but he understood soft power, and he deployed it very well. And that's exactly largely what we try to achieve at the Crawford Fund. I do wonder what John Crawford would think about the world in which we live, and particularly on the trade front, a passion of his, and what guidance he might offer us if he was with us today. Sadly, we don't have that opportunity. In his book, Homus Deus, Yuval Noah Harari reminded us that at the beginning of this century, more people died from obesity than starvation, more people died from old age than disease, and more people died from suicide than were killed in war. It is true that humanity continues to make great progress. We live longer, we're more wealthy, medical technology and procedures continue to improve, innovation is all around us, and many developing nations continue to make their way towards developed nation status. However, since Harari made his points, the world has become a less certain place and a less stable place. Distressingly, global hunger has been rising. And despite the heavy hand of government regulation in Western countries, the state of our natural environment continues to decline. It's not improving, it is declining. Given all of this, it's no wonder that President Trump's offer to disrupt governance in the United States appealed to enough American voters to have him re-elected as the President of the United States. The 20th century remains history's most violent, but the economic progress and the boost to living standards achieved in the period after the end of the Second World War was truly remarkable. Led by the United States, the liberal democratic West successfully promoted open trade and built a global rules-based order, which has also delivered relative peace and security. But that architecture, as we all know, is now under pressure, and the dominance of the West is being challenged. Meanwhile, changing climatic conditions are making our quest for greater security, including food security, more challenging. The history of the world is largely a story of the rise and fall of civilizations and great empires. Both the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine empires lasted more than 1,000 years. The British Empire, the largest by territory in history, lasted around 400 years. The Qing dynasty, by the way, lasted less than 300 years, but its legacy, including its territorial expansion, including into what we now know as Taiwan, continue to have impact on us today. Empires decline for many reasons, including, but not limited to, disease, drought, famine, corruption, invasion, internal dissent, poor leadership, and complacency. The US-led West is not technically an empire, of course. Indeed, 250 years ago, the good people of the American continent fought to free themselves of an empire. Rather, its model since the Second World War has been not to rule, but to lead and to build, to rebuild Europe, to build nation-state autonomy, and to build a rules-based global order to sustain them. Notwithstanding, I think it is instructive to compare the longevity of that model with those that went before it. The current architecture is just 80 years old, a short time by comparison. Yet Western leadership and influence are now under significant challenge, in large part, in my view, due to indulgence, complacency, and dare I say, even a failure to adequately reproduce ourselves. In 2025, I've seen zero justification for complacency. We are now in phase 3 of 3 periods since 1945. The long Cold War, the unipolar moment when US dominance was without challenge, and now a multipolar world which is making its way to a new dichotomy. On the one side, of course, is the liberal democratic West. On the other side is a bloc of nation-states, a line, including China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. It is clear that our geostrategic outlook is in decline, and in that environment, it is also clear that if an aggressor was to come after us, we'd have less warning time. Now, China, of course, is Australia's largest trading partner, so yes, it's a very complex and challenging environment. And given this changing strategic environment, Australia must do more to build both sovereign capability and the capacity to deter and deny any potential aggressor. That means we need to make some tough policy choices, which in turn will demand some tough policy trade-offs. Spending more on our defence capability and strengthening our alliance and partner country relationships is one of those tough choices. In the absence of more courageous revenue-raising issues like higher taxes, cuts in other areas where we don't want to fill them, or significant economic growth-generating measures, that will require trade-offs. But, as tempting as it is, strategic and defence policy are not what I want to dwell on tonight, although I might return to them slightly. Rather, I want to talk about economic strength, partly because you can't have the former without the latter. And more particularly, I believe there is now enough evidence to suggest, and John and I haven't been colluding on this subject, to suggest that our current pathway to net zero emissions is not without its risks, and therefore we have a responsibility to hedge against those risks by diversifying our approach, not to do less, but to do more. And on the question of risk management, we have to be cognizant of the reality that climate change is pushing us in a number of different spending directions. We are being pushed to invest more in mitigation, sequestration and adaptation because our changing climate poses many threats. One of those risks is the enhanced prospects of military conflict, and therefore we are being further pushed to bolster our ability to deter and deny any aggressor. These are all big fiscal burdens on the Commonwealth budget. And of course, to do all of that, we need a strong economy with a strong industrial base. We can spend more on defence without raising taxes or cutting spending elsewhere if we bolster our economic growth and we spend smarter. But more money won't be enough without the ability to efficiently manufacture, maintain and sustain defence platforms, and without a full and energetic embrace of artificial intelligence and all that it offers. The latter includes the deployment of policy frameworks which accommodate data centres those energy-hungry data centres. So we need better planning policy, industry policy, environmental policy, and of course energy policy. Reconciling our strategic and economic interests, including our US and China relationships, is no easy task. Trade-offs and tough choices will be the lot of our politicians in the years ahead. While not world's worst, our public debt is too high, and our demographic challenge has not gone away. Our workforce continues to age, and despite high levels of youth idleness, and employment vacancies remain too high and too common. Australia's productivity growth has been too low for too long, and despite admirable public policy initiatives, we still lack the tradespeople and other skilled workers we need to lift productivity and to grow our economy while also keeping downward pressure on inflation and interest rates. I welcome the government's decision to tackle our productivity performance as a matter of priority, and there'll be plenty of potential ideas when the government's economic roundtable is convened next week. But for me, two ideas should be an immediate priority. The first is the weight of regulatory burden. The second is a more imaginative and creative approach to our climate change challenge. The heavy hand of government regulation is choking Western economies and suppressing growth in capital stock. Growth in our physical stock and its depth should be benchmarks not against those of our Western partners, but rather the fast-growing countries of our region. Of course, in budget terms, addressing regulatory burden is a no or low-cost option for lifting productivity. As a non-executive board member on an ASX company, I regularly see this problem close up. Indeed, those sitting in boardrooms around our country are hesitating and procrastinating in the face of ESG uncertainties, and the haunt of proxy advisors is always with them. Investment in new and more efficient plant and equipment will be a crucial part of building a more competitive economy. Modern manufacturing plants also help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Further, new investment in manufacturing is crucial to rebuilding sovereign capability, a term which has become particularly sexy since the advent of COVID-19. But investment is not flowing as it should, because in this regulatory environment, it's all too hard and all too risky. High energy prices are also a key factor. On another front, there is plenty of talk and promise on housing affordability and availability. But despite some policy movement, there remains far too much emphasis on demand-side responses. Demand-side solutions which are weighing heavily on the budgets of both the Commonwealth and the states. There is too little action on the supply side, and in particular, our land development and building approvals processes. In the absence of significant change, rezoning and housing development approval processes will continue to drag on for years, as will construction timeframes. But many of these delays are due to biodiversity constraints. Biodiversity is critically important, but more sensible and balanced creative approaches are needed. It's not just about providing housing for young families. More housing promotes labour mobility, and of course labour mobility is a key to lifting our productivity. There can be no doubt that red and green tape are holding back our economy. Just ask those who import or export goods in and out of Australia, particularly those who work in agriculture. Our approvals system is archaic. It's 20th century at best. It lags many developing countries in terms of simplicity or complexity. The second thing we need to do urgently is think about our approach to climate change challenge. The current framework abounds with greenwashing, rent-seeking, unrealistic targets, and ultra-optimistic views about emerging technologies. There are a few egos in there too. Public trust in Western politicians and public institutions is being further eroded by what appears to some to be one set of rules for the renewable sector and another set of rules for everything else. Our climate is changing in adverse ways. The evidence of that is all around us every day. But we don't have to hold our economy back to be a world leader in climate change action. We need to adjust, recalibrate, and broaden our course of action. Our evolving strategic situation is demanding we build more sovereign capability, yet our recent climate policy pathway is not sufficiently strengthening our capacity to do so. Our strategic competitors, of course, are not making the same mistake. This can and should change. The first thing we need to do is remove the ill-considered prohibitions on nuclear electricity generation. The arguments that this carbon-free technology is too expensive or takes too long to build might be right, but I say let's lift the prohibition and let the market decide. It's common sense. Australia, of course, has enormous reserves of uranium, and we sell our ore to countries all around the world to generate electricity, zero carbon electricity. Yet we are closed to generating the same electricity here in Australia. It simply isn't rational. The second thing we need to do is follow the example of the first Rudd government. Great government it was, I was part of it. That's one of the reasons it was great, John. And focus more on carbon capture and storage. I'm constantly bemused by those who say this technology does not work or cannot be done at the right cost. They say that even though it's happening here and right around the world and has been happening for some time in Norway in the oil sector, probably 30 years. Indeed, in the Moomba Basin alone, Santos recently safely stored its 1 millionth tonne of carbon. That's the equivalent of closing down a decent-sized coal-fired generator for a year. Ironically, the people who say carbon and capture doesn't work regularly preach the green hydrogen and green steel gospel, even though, as the market has shown us recently, neither is yet viable. We are endowed with enough gas in Australia to provide for all of our domestic needs, both household and industrial, and all the gas we want to export into lucrative export markets. But we just lack the will to fully exploit our reserves. This makes no sense. Gas can now be scrubbed of its carbon, and we desperately need it as a transition fuel. And more carbon scrubbed gas provides the opportunity to produce blue hydrogen, a more viable proposition at this time than is green hydrogen. The next thing we should do is just accept that the life of some of our coal generators might need to be extended beyond the ideal. It's just a simple fact of physics that this will be necessary to keep our energy grid stable. Of course, meanwhile, China and India are building new coal generators, as I speak, and every week. A stable energy grid will help us accelerate the transition to a lower carbon world. That's important. Globally, there is plenty of emphasis on mitigation, but not enough focus on adaptation and sequestration, biological, geological, and technological. We can do so much more in the land sector. We need to put the net back into net zero emissions. We hear our political leaders talk all the time about mitigation technologies, but we never really hear them talk about the net part of the equation. And the land sector could play a much larger role if just given the chance. It can also, of course, in doing so, add to our biodiversity stock. One of the many things that makes government challenging is a thing we call information or knowledge asymmetry, the information gap between policymakers and the electorate. Knowledge asymmetry creates an opportunity for those opposed to a sensible initiative to run political interference by peddling misinformation and disinformation. But I have to be frank in saying, I think John might agree, but is the key problem in the land sector is that too few politicians sufficiently understand it. It's like the orphan of public policy. Until there's a public controversy, it's a policy area left to those with a portfolio responsibility and a few people that might have an agricultural background. I have to say they're becoming less in number, John, as well. Of course, geography is part of the explanation for the lack of interest in the sector. And agriculture is complex. And if you don't understand how a device works, you won't use it. And you won't really take an interest in it. And as you all know only too well, smarter farming, healthier soils help to build resilience and food security by sequestering more carbon and holding more drought-proofing moisture. Yet the regulatory regime remains unfriendly to those hoping to secure carbon credits for improving carbon sequestration in soils. Australia has a pretty good carbon trading framework and it's improving. And yes, we need to protect the integrity of that framework and ensure that any sequestration is permanent. But we don't appear to be trying all that hard, in my view. We need to do more to provide certainty for those willing to invest, in those prepared to change their operations, but they need the support. Food manufacturers are doing their bit by working with growers and producers to lift productivity and environmental outcomes. We should provide them with more support and incentives to do even more. We can also do more in the area of crop-based biofuels produced from non-food cover crops like carinata or Ethiopian mustard. This includes sustainable aviation fuels, which will have the additional benefit of further progressing and protecting our sovereignty. The forestry sector is also part of the solution. To the federal government's credit, it not long ago removed a thing called the water rule. I'm not going to go into the history of the water rule, but the water rule dictated that if you're planting forestry trees, you can only get carbon credits if you're planting them where the rainfall is so low you can't grow a tree. You can't make this stuff up. There was one of those compromises in the Senate, as was, of course, the prohibition on nuclear generation. Land prices are holding plantings back. It's just too expensive to grow trees on land. The government, to its credit, is doing something about that. It has planting grants to lower that investment hurdle, but so much more needs to be done. Farm forestry, some are embracing it, but nowhere near enough because they just don't get the encouragement from government. Farm forestry entails, of course, planting trees on the least productive parts of your property, and that's good for carbon sequestration, it's good for animal welfare, and it's good for the farm's ecosystem. It's good for water retention, it's good for soil erosion, but who's talking about it? Do the leading politicians talk about this when they're standing at their press conferences? No, because there's no public push to put the net part back into net zero emissions. Trees are our great carbon sink. A native tree slowly ceases to absorb carbon as it ages. If it dies or is burned in situ, it releases the carbon back into the atmosphere. But a harvested tree, selectively and sustainably harvested tree, the ones we use to build the furniture and window frames and staircases we love so much, stores the carbon in that product forever. And of course, when it's harvested, it's reseeded. So a young tree starts that whole photosynthesis process. Again, I know I'm teaching you things now that you all know better than me. Very conscious of that. Yet 2 of our states have banned selective and sustainable native forestry harvesting. The Victorian government closed down the industry only to import native logs from Tasmania, all in the name of the environment. The logs, of course, were to be used in a sawmill partly owned by the Victorian government. The only things the native forestry bans achieved are the build-up of bushfire promoting undergrowth and greater difficulty for wildlife trying to navigate the forest floor. Closing down our native forestry sector forces us to import our timber from other countries that don't have our very, very high sustainability and environmental standards. State governments surely now have the responsibility to acknowledge the greater role forestry can play in our efforts to address the climate change challenge. Another great opportunity that rarely rates a mention is to the quest to reduce methane in our cattle. Asparagopsis gets a mention, but rarely heard, not in the circles I mix in anyway. But for me, our nascent capacity to rapidly accelerate breeding changes is even more exciting. We now have the technology to accelerate this change at scale, to both reduce methane and to lift productivity in both our beef and dairy sectors. This technology, of course, would be a great gift to the Global South too. One Queensland-based company is close to commercialising a platform which would provide every cattle producer and dairy farmer with the tools necessary to achieve affordable, accelerated genetic improvement through in vitro production of embryos. But you don't read about it or hear a politician talking about it, and you don't see the financiers running to back the technology. They are too focused on decades-old technologies like wind turbines and solar panels, many decades old, or the elusive steel and green hydrogen. It disappoints me that so much public money goes to subsidising what could be now fairly considered legacy technologies, and by comparison, so little money going to promote new innovation. Some of the examples I've given tonight: innovation of the production, consumption and sequestration sides of the equation. A greater role for the land sector in our climate change response should be pushed to the top of the public policy agenda, and our ambitions for it should extend well beyond our shores. In other words, we're doing world's best here, it can enhance our work elsewhere. John Crawford, I believe, would have it no other way. He taught us to be ambitious, energetic, hard-working. He demonstrated we have the capacity to shape international public policy, research methods, and global research institutions. Indeed, to lead in the development of new institutions, both home and abroad. This, of course, is a great part of his legacy. You often hear people say we can't change the climate from Australia. It's probably right. But we can show leadership. Just as it's true, we may never realise the dream of being a renewable energy superpower. We can, though, be an energy superpower, and we can help benefit the world in doing so. We can turbocharge the quest for greater global food security. We have abundant reserves of oil and gas, it's our great strength, and we are blessed with plenty of wind, sunlight and land. We have plenty of smart people too, and plenty of smart research organisations too, of which are major sponsors tonight, CSIRO and the GRDC. We have the people. We just need the public support. And we will never manufacture wind turbines or solar panels in Australia at significant scale, nor indeed can we manufacture them at a globally competitive price. But we can be a global leader in soil health and carbon sequestration. We have already demonstrated our forestry sector is world's best practice, and we can help others develop and follow those standards. We can lead the way in the production of biofuels and from non-food cover crops, lowering emissions and strengthening food security, and indeed our broader national security by making us less dependent on imported fuels. We can be a world leader in methane reduction in our livestock breeding systems. And beyond the land sector, there are two areas of greenhouse gas mitigation in which Australia enjoys a competitive advantage. The first is in blue hydrogen, which I mentioned. We are only 4 countries in the world that have very significant reserves of lignite, or what's commonly known as brown coal. Coal that can be mined, scrubbed of its carbon, and turned into blue hydrogen. This is viable, unlike the challenges of green hydrogen. But there's no movement for it. There doesn't seem to be any public support for it, so the politicians aren't talking about it. And like few other countries, we can deploy carbon capture technologies before producing blue hydrogen on these extensive reserves. Second, we have the geological formations to receive and permanently store carbon captured from the processes of our trading partners. That will be a good thing for the planet. In other words, Japan's burning coal, our coal, we take the carbon back and bury it in our geology, safely, proven to be safe. Good for the planet, good for our economy, but no one's really talking about it, although 2 years ago it was in the public debate and the government did support a change to a thing called the London Protocol, I hope I got that right, which does give it a legal framework and does give us the capacity to do it. When it's coming from Japan, it would be great for our relationship with an important partner as well. Wind and solar will continue to play a major role in our efforts to meet our net zero aspirations. I'm not here to be critical of wind and solar, but they won't be enough on their own. They are too intermittent, they are too disruptive, and securing social licence for the rollout will become more difficult, not less difficult, as we pursue greater and greater scale, for obvious reason. We are smart enough in Australia to chew gum and walk too. Now, I suspect in the Great Hall tonight, an iconic place, or no one in the Great Hall tonight would consider themselves an activist. I could be wrong. Some of our scholars might be activists, I'm not sure. And it would be inappropriate for many people in certain positions tonight to be activists. But I believe those of us with an interest in agriculture, food production, and the like, have a responsibility to do two things. The first is to take every opportunity to highlight the greater role the land sector can play in our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, while also, of course, reminding people of the great work we collectively do helping others build food security. And second, to convince others that a science and evidence-based approach to policy is always the most efficient and effective approach. And it sounds like a good note there for me to close, because I don't think anyone in this room is going to disagree with that. I thank you all for the wonderful work you do, and I wish us all a very productive and successful conference.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mikayla Hyland-Wood. For the past 2 years, I have been very fortunate to lead the Researchers in Agriculture for International Development Network, or RAID, as many of you may know it. We are the Crawford Fund's early and mid-career professional network that seeks to connect, engage, and support the next generation. And it's on behalf of this amazing network that I would like to offer a vote of thanks to the Hon Joel Fitzgibbon for his thought-provoking address tonight, reflecting many of the values of Sir John Crawford's legacy. Please join me in thanking Joel once again. Your messages of thoughtful engagement with policymakers, trade-offs and tough choices when it matters, and looking to history as we look forward resonated with me deeply, particularly as we continue to navigate a time of increasing complexity and uncertainty. It's in these times that the link between food and water security and national security becomes clear. So there are no two ways about it. We're living in a time where the value of international agriculture is growing, despite impactful and meaningful investments. This is not to diminish the work that has been done, but rather to highlight its critical soft power role in shaping a safe, secure, and prosperous region. The fact that nutrition security ranks so high on the list of our neighbours' challenges, and will continue to do so as those countries feel the squeeze from regional unrest, natural disasters, pest and disease pressures, means that now more than ever we must invest strategically, lead with humility, and reflect often. In these challenging times, I would argue that opportunity is abundant, and not just because I hope for a job in my future. Seeing challenges this way ensures that we continue to invest in young professionals that carry the disciplinary expertise, passion, and pragmatism to look at the tough stuff and say, we can handle that. We see this opportunity being grasped with both hands by the next generation, represented by the scholars, keynote listeners, and the RAID Network members in the room tonight. So as you consider your own takeaways from Joel's speech, I would ask you to reflect too on the role of these emerging researchers, not as the answer, but as a piece to the puzzle. I'd ask you to reflect on our role as students, as we learn from your successes and the lessons when things didn't go quite right. Our role as ambassadors, as Australia redefines how we work with partner countries to uphold our values. And as our role as leaders, as we carry the burden when others must hang up their hats. So if you have the chance, please share those reflections with someone near you tonight. Thank you, Joel, once again for a wonderful address, and Kathy for this opportunity. I wish you all the very best at the conference tomorrow.